Back in the summer of 2019, right after Nintendo revealed that the sequel to Breath of the Wild was in development, the Zelda community went through what I would call a bit of a Zonai craze. Suddenly, everyone, including myself, was talking about the Zonai. Who were the Zonai? What are the Zonai? Zonai this, Zonai that. Oh my god, it's a Zonai swirl. It got so bad at one point that many fans actually grew tired of hearing about them, and even started avoiding the subject altogether. Which, looking back now, is kind of funny to think about, because the Zonai were kind of a footnote in Breath of the Wild's overall mythology. There's only a few paragraphs devoted to them in creating a champion, and they're never spoken about by anyone in the game's dialogue. In fact, they were so unremarkable that if you search for the word Zonai right here on YouTube, you'll find that before 2019, in the first 2 years following Breath of the Wild's launch, only 2 videos had been made about the Zonai. I repeat, 2 Zonai videos in 2 years, which is kinda crazy knowing what we know now. The oldest Zonai video on YouTube, titled The Legend of Zelda Zonai Barbarians, was posted by Hyrulean Historian on May 7, 2017, only 2 months after Breath of the Wild came out. It was in fact the only theory video about the subject to come out that year, with the next Zonai video by Game Over Jesse coming out a full year later, on March 15, 2018. Looking back now, Hyrulean's video was very much ahead of its time. While the topic of the Zonai was no doubt being discussed on forums and social media before this, Hyrulean was the first to lay it all out in video format, and it sort of cemented the term Zonai as a way to refer to the actual people who built these mysterious ruins scattered across Hyrule. Because believe it or not, at the time of Hyrulean's video, we couldn't even know for sure what these people were actually called. The name was derived from a particular set of ruins in the Faron region, but as we all know, several types of these ruins exist all over the kingdom, and they all have completely different names attributed to it, like Typhlo, Lome, Thundra, and Palmyrea. But no one referred to these people as Typhlonians or Lomanians or Palmyreans. Somehow Zonai was the name that stuck, and this was all because of one specific connection, namely the Barbarian outfit. Each piece of this armor set is found inside one of the Lome labyrinths, 3 massive stone structures which many were convinced were also made by the same group of people, mainly because of the dragon motifs, spiral engravings, and other similar ornaments. According to the item description of each armor piece, the outfit once belonged to a warlike tribe of barbarians from the Faron region, and since the Zonai ruins are located in Faron, people assumed that this must have been their home base, and hence the name Zonai became synonymous with these so-called barbarians from ancient times. But mind you, this was just a theory back then, at least for a little while, and it wouldn't be until creating a champion that the name Zonai, which actually turned out to be an anagram of Nazo, meaning mystery in Japanese, was confirmed to be the canonical name of this mystery tribe. Additionally, the book also revealed for the first time that the Zonai excelled in the use of magic and that they all disappeared for reasons unknown, which are details that are never stated in the game itself. For the longest time, this is all we had to work with regarding the Zonai. Allegedly, they were a group of powerful warriors and magic users who dominated Hyrule in an age long ago. They built impressive structures, they were apparently dressed something like this, they loved spirals, they revered owls, boars, and especially dragons or serpents, and they all disappeared off the face of the earth at some point, leaving only their impressive stonework behind. And well, that's about all we knew about them. Like I said before, the subject of the Zonai didn't really take off until the E3 2019 teaser for the sequel, which showed a variety of underground structures that are eerily similar to the ones we found on the surface. This is when theories about the Zonai absolutely exploded, and suddenly everyone and their mother began speculating about this previously obscure mystery tribe and what kind of role they could play in the upcoming sequel. Still, we had very little to work with at this point. The only new revelation which got woven into the Zonai lore was the enigmatic green glowing hand keeping Ganondorf pinned down, which of course later turned out to be Rauru, but obviously we didn't know that back then. No one knew what the Zonai actually looked like, or even what their intentions were. Most people assumed that they were good guys who sealed Ganondorf away, but there were some who theorized that maybe they were actually followers of the Demon King, and were perhaps wiped out by the Hylians because of this. Safe to say, everyone had wildly different ideas about who these people were and what their backstory was. But there is one thing that most Zonai theories had in common, and that is the assumption that they were human, or at the very least something close to a human. And you can definitely see this from the fan art that was floating around at the time. They all depict people, sometimes jungle-based warriors, or wizard-like figures wearing cloaks, humanoids with glowing skin, obviously inspired by the glowing hand in the teaser. There was no shortage of creative concepts, but the point is, they were all human-like in appearance. And well, as Tears of the Kingdom revealed, that's not exactly accurate. Turns out the Zonai Zonai are actually 10 feet tall anthropomorphic beings with huge fox-like ears. And while they do have some human characteristics, they're definitely not a conventional human, so to speak, and pretty far removed from how most people envisioned them before Tears of the Kingdom. This was great news for the furry community, no doubt, but also very confusing for the lore freaks among us. Because if this is a Zonai, then what the heck was this whole savage barbarians who love war all about? Before Tears of the Kingdom, this outfit was quite literally the face of the Zonai. If you look up old videos about them from back in the day, chances are the barbarian outfit is featured in the thumbnail in some way. And understandably so. It and its description was like the one thing we thought we knew about them besides their architecture. But Tears of the Kingdom seems to have thrown that idea out the window. So could it be that we were wrong all this time? Was the connection we made between the Zonai architecture and the barbarian armor a mistake or a misinterpretation? Or is it simply a retcon by the Zelda team? To find out more, let's reassess the situation using our current understanding of the Zonai and then go over some of the most likely options as to who these so-called barbarians could have been. Now, before we get into the armor itself and its origins, let's quickly define what exactly a barbarian is and how it applies to the Zelda universe, because it's worth pointing out that there's a huge distinction to be made between historically accurate barbarians and the modern-day barbarian from pop culture. Originally, it was just a term used to refer to outsiders who didn't share the same language and culture, primarily by the ancient Greeks and Romans, though the Chinese, for example, also had their equivalent of a barbarian. In that sense, it was basically a synonym for the word foreigner or outsider, and did not apply to any specific tribe or ethnic group. As such, there's no real precedent for what exactly a barbarian looked like. It's just that as language evolved, the term became more and more negatively charged, and started being associated with things like primitive, savage, uncivilized, warlike, etc. It's no different than calling someone who's aggressive or destructive a Neanderthal, even though there's no evidence that Neanderthals were any more or less violent than Homo sapiens. This change in language and definition is what the so-called fantasy barbarians evolved from, which are usually depicted as stoic, muscular, often scarcely dressed warriors who value brute strength over anything else. There's also a noticeable overlap with Viking culture, which in and of itself has been warped and stereotyped far beyond their real-life counterparts, but I digress. Anyway, it's clear that this fictional version is what the Zelda team leaned into, because you can definitely see a lot of the same traits on the barbarian outfit. Things like war paint, skulls and bone decorations, braided hair, X-shaped harnesses, animal fur and pelts. Wait, how did that get in here? But yeah, these are all things that are present on the barbarian outfit as well. And even the traits mentioned in the description of the armor, such as warlike, savage, and brute strength, match those of a typical barbarian warrior from a game of D&D, for example. So, to what degree do these traits hold up against the Zonai and their culture? Well, if you play Tears of the Kingdom, you'll know, not a whole lot. The Zonai as depicted in Tears of the Kingdom are the complete opposite of forest-dwelling, warmongering savages. They were a highly sophisticated society, whose technology dwarfed that of everyone else. So much so that whenever they made their presence known, they were revered as gods by those on the surface below. There's also no real evidence that they had a lust for war and conquest. In fact, if they did, they sure had a strange way of going about it. I mean, these guys had energy cannons, lasers, robot soldiers, vehicles of all shapes and sizes, not to mention their inherent magic powers and the secret stones. Safe to say, they could have crushed Hyrule in less than a day if they really wanted to. Because as stated in Masterworks, the people on the surface like the Hylians, Gorons, Zora and Gerudo were primitive in comparison. If a war did break out between the Zonai and everyone else alive back then, it would be like a medieval army facing off against a 21st century war machine. But again, there are no records of such a battle ever taking place. Instead, the Zonai spent most of their existence isolated in the skies above, and only occasionally interacted with the tribes on the surface, and always in good faith, as far as we know. But perhaps most important of all, we know what the Zonai dressed like, and it's not congruent with the barbarian armor whatsoever. Aside from the fact that they are physically way too big to even fit into an armor like this, we also don't see any of their traditional insignia, like the Zonai eye symbol, the triangle pattern, dragon motif, spirals, or their writing. Instead, the armor has a symbol of its own, this circular design on the belt buckle and on those metal discs hanging from the hips and chest, which kinda looks like a Pokeball actually. We'll talk more about this symbol later on, but for now, I think it's safe to say that this design does not match any Zonai ornaments that we know of. This sudden disconnect between the Zonai, as portrayed in the sequel, and the Barbarian armor was definitely a surprising turn of events. As mentioned before, it was a staple of Zonai theories for so many years, and so it did feel like a bit of a retcon to many people. Now, having said that, it's worth pointing out that it was never outright confirmed anywhere that the Barbarian armor and the Zonai are actually related. That's an assumption we made back in the day, based on very limited information. In fact, this whole idea was built on just 2 data points: the description of the armor, which connects it to Faron, and the fact that the outfit is found inside Zonai structures, i.e. the labyrinths. As far as evidence goes, this used to be pretty convincing back when it was just Breath of the Wild. However, with the added context of Tears of the Kingdom, it seems these 2 facts don't prove much of anything anymore. For starters, if we look at the description, yes, it does clearly state that those who wore this outfit either originated from or lived in the Faron province. That much is confirmed, and there's not a whole lot of room for interpretation here. What's less obvious, however, is whether this tribe was also connected to the Zonai ruins, because that's not a given per se. As I've stated many times before in my videos, Hyrule is an incredibly old place, with a history spanning countless millennia. It's not unreasonable to assume that Faron has likely been inhabited by more than one group of people. And so just because these barbarians once called Faron home does not automatically mean that they were also the ones who built these structures. It's more than possible that they lived here before they were built, or long after. I mean, we are talking about tens of thousands of years of unrecorded history here. Next is the location of the armor set, and here too, there's not really anything conclusive. While you do have to navigate the labyrinths in order to get the Barbarian armor, at least in Breath of the Wild, it's technically not found inside the maze itself, but rather inside a Sheikah shrine. Now, we know that both the Hylians and the Sheikah kept all sorts of historical treasures and artifacts, including several clothing sets, masks, helmets, and so on. According to the stories, many of these were kept in a secret vault inside Hyrule Castle, and would later be stolen away by a famous bandit named Misko. Others, like the rubber suit, the climbing gear, and the Barbarian armor, ended up in the hands of the Sheikah, and stored inside one of their many shrines. Breath of the Wild also made it apparent that the Sheikah knew practically nothing about the Zonai. Not even the 10,000-year-old monks ever mention anything about them, something you think they would if they did know. After all, the origins of Calamity Ganon and the fate of Hyrule are intrinsically connected to them. As such, there's a real possibility that the location of the Barbarian outfit is purely a coincidence. After all, there are plenty of Sheikah shrines in and around Zonai structures, and they all hold vastly different rewards, like a Hylian broadsword in the Palmyrea shrine, a Sheikah-made ancient core in Typhlo ruins, or the rubber suit from the Thundra Plateau shrine, which is clearly an ancient Zora treasure. So just because an item is found inside a shrine, inside a Zonai ruin, is clearly not indicative of its origin. Either the Barbarian armor is the exception, or contrary to our previous beliefs, it has no relation to the Zonai either. There's also the fact that in Tears of the Kingdom, the labyrinths now contain the Phantom Ganon armor instead of the Barbarian set, which is now found inside random caves all across Hyrule, so there's no real consistency here. In conclusion, I think there's a very good chance that the Zonai we know from Tears of the Kingdom and the barbarians who are said to have roamed the jungles of Faron are 2 completely different groups. And while it is possible that there may have been contact between the 2, either friendly or hostile, there's little to no evidence that they are one and the same. Which begs the question, who, if not the Zonai, were the barbarians of Faron? Because the barbarians are evidently no longer around today, the search for potential candidates has largely been focused on other missing groups, factions or tribes we know existed at one point, but no longer do, which as it stands can be narrowed down to 3 confirmed cases: the Zonai, the ancient hero's aspect, or rather the species he represents, and the unknown creatures depicted in these statues below ground, as well as on the tablet in Lookout Landing. Now, while you could make a case for each of these groups being the fabled barbarians, and, make it work somehow, there is, in my opinion, one prominent issue that presides over all of these candidates, which is that none of them fit the profile of the barbarian armor. And when I say profile, I mean both physically and culturally. We already talked extensively about the Zonai and how they differ from what the barbarians are implied to have been like, so I'm not going to repeat myself. The only thing I do want to address is a theory I've seen floating around quite a lot, which is that perhaps some sort of evil, warlike variant of the Zonai existed, a bit like the split between the Sheikah and the Yiga. Maybe a rebellious subgroup who chose to stay on the surface and establish their own society inside Faron. While I don't discount the possibility altogether, there's no hard evidence that these hypothetical evil Zonai ever existed. And even if there was, the same logic would apply to them as much as the regular Zonai. Namely, why didn't they use their superior technology and magic powers to conquer Hyrule, instead of running around the jungle dressed in fur and bones like a bunch of cavemen? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You'd also expect to see at least some remnants of the culture they originally came from. For example, even after 10,000 years of separation, the Yiga's origins can still easily be traced back to the Sheikah. Despite their vastly different goals and alliances, they still share similar customs, symbolisms, fighting styles, fashion, and so on. But we don't see this at all with the Zonai and the Barbarian outfit. The same could be said about the ancient hero and his people, though in this case there are a few superficial similarities worth looking into. Now, I'm not going to speculate whether this guy is some sort of a mix between a Zonai and something else, like a Hylian perhaps. I thought he was initially, but I've had some serious doubts about that ever since. Whatever the case, two things that do somewhat match the Barbarian aesthetics are the long red hair and the body paint, which call back to the hair on the Barbarian helmet and the war paint respectively. However, in my opinion, these parallels don't necessarily prove a connection. First of all, the two hairstyles are quite different from each other, with the heroes being completely straight, while the hair on the helmet is braided and features hairbands. It's also clear that the hair is a design feature that's part of the helmet itself, similar to some helmets from ancient Greece, for example. It seems to me that whoever designed the Barbarian helmet was trying to emulate or pay tribute to something, or someone they admired or worshipped, perhaps. Alternatively, it could have been tied to rank or stature within the tribe or something, who knows. As for the hero's paint job, the differences far outweigh the similarities. The war paint on the Barbarian armor is crude compared to the ornate decorations on the hero's body. In fact, his body paint falls more in line with that of Sonya's, particularly the Zonai eye symbol on the shoulders. Meanwhile, the paint on the Barbarian armor is very basic, and actually has more in common with the streaks and patterns seen on the bodies of some monsters, like bokoblins and moblins. But by far the most damning evidence against the hero's aspect is that the footwear of the Barbarian armor is clearly not designed for a creature with canine-like paws, the likes of which we see on the ancient hero, which is a bit strange if the outfit was meant to originate from his people. So no, I currently do not think the barbarians are related to this guy, and it doesn't help that there's little to no information about the ancient hero. I mean, for all we know, he's the only one of his kind, and he doesn't have a tribe, but maybe we'll learn more about that in Age of Imprisonment. Speaking of which, lastly we have the statues in the underground, and just like the ancient hero, we know next to nothing about these beings. We don't know their language, their history, and because their existence is memorialized in stone only, we don't even know their true size. After all, the other statues like the Goron, Zora, Rito, and Gerudo are not proportional to real life either. That being said, the statues do feature clothing, so we do have a rough idea what their fashion was like. And needless to say, it looks nothing like the Barbarian outfit, and more like some sort of metal plate armor. There's no helmet present, no engravings or patterns that match the Pokeball symbol, and they also appear to be barefoot, instead of wearing sandals and leg wraps. I get the impression that whoever they were, they seem to have been a subterranean species only, given the fact that we don't find any remnants of their culture on the surface above. So those are my thoughts on the three missing factions. Like I said, when it comes to the Barbarian connection, you could argue a case for any of them, since the information we have is very limited. But for me personally, the more I look at the outfit, the more I'm convinced that it was made by and for human beings, not furries, half-furries, or mole people. So now let me present my case regarding the Barbarian's identity, which, mind you, is not actually a new theory, but rather a very old one in a new context. If we are to assume that the barbarians of Faron were indeed human, then the first questions we have to ask are, why were they dressed like this, and where did their allegiance lie? While we don't have anything conclusive to work with, even after 2 games and 2 books, we did receive some additional info in the recent Switch 2 ports of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, specifically the voice memories, one of which immediately grabbed my attention as I was doing research for this topic. In one of Zelda's memories, she talks about a location in central Hyrule, known as the Bottomless Swamp. This place has been steeped in mystery ever since Breath of the Wild. However, no information was given about its history or purpose. Until now, that is. And the implications could be relevant for today's theory. So let's hear what Zelda has to say.
I have heard that the giant fossil in Bottomless Swamp was once worshipped by cultists who considered it the Demon King from ancient times. It is said that their blasphemous words against the goddess summoned evil spirits, turning the water impure and changing the very shapes of the rocks to ominous forms. Now it serves as a den for monsters, so setting foot inside is not possible.
So, according to Zelda, the Bottomless Swamp used to be some kind of ritualistic site, a place of worship for what she describes as cultists who admired the Demon King. According to her, these people believe that the giant skull that sits in the middle of the swamp are the ancient remains of the Demon King himself. But whether that's actually the case, or just a delusional fantasy conjured up by the cult, is not confirmed. Now, the fact that the Demon King had human followers is nothing groundbreaking. There's a long history of groups and individuals who align themselves with the forces of evil in some way, shape, or form. What is interesting, though, is the so-called fossil itself. When viewed in isolation and with the model reassembled accordingly, it bears some resemblance to the Barbarian helmet, in particular the horns, which in both cases start on the side of the skull and then curve down towards the jawline. The skull on the Barbarian helmet has been a topic of debate ever since 2017, because it doesn't seem to match any animal or monster that we know of. Some believe it belonged to a creature which has since gone extinct. Others suspect that the skull may not even be real bone, and is instead made of wood or some other material. So either it's real and the creature it belonged to is long gone, or it's man-made, and thus a deliberate design choice, like a mask. Whatever the case may be, if the barbarians and the cultists mentioned in Zelda's memory are indeed one and the same, then it would explain some of the design choices on the barbarian outfit. The demonic skull, the red hair, which could be an homage to Ganon's hairdo, and in particular the war paint, which as mentioned before has a lot in common with the paint-like patterns on some of Ganon's minions. The body paint on the Barbarian armor is said to bolster the attack power of its user, which seems to coincide with the way it works for monsters, as the more powerful variants like black, silver, and gold are considerably stronger than their red and blue counterparts. The game implies that this increase in power has something to do with a kind of wicked magic, something a Ganon cultist would definitely want to tap into. There's also of course the fact that strength or power is a virtue mostly related to Ganon, as opposed to the wisdom of the princess, or the hero's virtue of courage. Assuming for a moment that the barbarians were Demon King loyalists, then it makes sense that they would try to emulate aspects of not just him, but his other followers as well, which could be why their dress code was rather primitive and scarcely clad, just like Ganon's monsters, who also have a lot of exposed skin, arm and leg wraps, as well as loincloths made from animal skin. The same could apply to their weapons of choice as well. Unfortunately, the outfit doesn't come with any matching weapons, so we don't know for sure what they actually wielded in battle. However, we can make an educated guess. The bone strapped to the right arm of the outfit, for example, is very reminiscent of dragon bone, a material exclusively used by monsters to fashion weapons, shields, bows, and even parts of their armor. So perhaps this detail on the barbarian armor is an indication that they too favored dragon bone weaponry, because of its affiliation with Ganon's minions. I mean, they definitely fit the primitive aesthetics of the armor the most, if you ask me. And the same could be said about the chest harness, which looks similar to the ones Lynels wear, for example. Lastly, and this is more of a stray thought I came up with at the last minute, but the fact that in Breath of the Wild the Labyrinths hold the Barbarian armor, while in Tears of the Kingdom the same structures hold the Phantom Ganon set, could be another clue that the Barbarians had some kind of affiliation with the Demon King as opposed to the Zonai. Now, with all that in mind, we arrive at the next question. If the Barbarians were indeed human followers or cultists devoted to Ganon, which group did they originate from? Were they Hylians, a subvariant of the Yiga, or something else entirely? When it comes right down to it, there's really only two options when it comes to their origin. Either they were native to Hyrule, or they originated from outside the kingdom, i.e. foreigners. If they were natives, then the most likely scenario is that they were simply disgruntled citizens of Hyrule, those who, for one reason or another, opposed the gods and Hyrule's monarchy and swore fealty to the Demon King of old instead. In other words, traitors or anarchists. Naturally, this would have made them an enemy of the royal family and by extension the rest of the kingdom, and might explain why they chose Faron of all places as their home base. The vast and dense jungles that make up most of the province would be the perfect hideout for enemies of the state after all. Now, as stated before, the other option is that the barbarians came from outside the borders, and there are at least some indications that invading forces were a problem for the Hylian Empire. For example, according to Creating a Champion, Akkala Citadel was specifically designed to repel invaders who came from the eastern seas, which is part of the reason why it fell during the Calamity, as the Guardians came from the west instead. Anyway, whoever these so-called eastern invaders were, the barbarians would definitely fit this profile, since, as I explained in my little history section, the word barbarian originally referred to outsiders from foreign lands, and also included seafaring groups like the Vikings. That being said, if the barbarian tribe was simply a group of natives, then that's pretty much the end of it. They could have been anyone, Hylians, Sheikah, maybe even a few stray Gerudo who remained loyal to Ganondorf after the imprisoning war. And considering that Age of Imprisonment will be the final story in this saga, I doubt we'll ever learn who they truly were. However, if they were foreign invaders who sailed into Hyrule at one point in history, then we can take this theory a little further, because there is one candidate I haven't mentioned yet that could check that box. In the first chapter of the video, I spent quite some time highlighting the history and progression of Zonai theories as the years went on, including the first Zonai video ever made by Larulian historian. And that wasn't just padding, there's an actual reason I did that. See, back in those days, there was a strong belief that there was a connection between not just the Zonai and the Barbarian armor, but also Lorellin, the lone seaside village on the eastern border of Faron. The idea was that the people of Lorellin could be descendants of the fabled barbarians, which again, at the time we assumed were the Zonai, and there's a couple of hints that brought us to that conclusion. First and foremost is the obvious fact that it's the only settlement located in the Faron province, albeit on the shoreline east of the jungle. The village also has a very distinct culture from the rest of Hyrule. There's a big emphasis on ships, especially in their architecture. Besides that, they are known for their fishing skills, their fashion is noticeably different, and they have a strong affinity for the seas in general. Now, while it is true that these people are classified as Hylians, it's worth pointing out that Hylian is not a race, nor an ethnic group. It simply refers to all humans who are part of the Hylian Empire. For example, the Sheikah and even the Yiga are also classified as Hylians, despite their unique culture and customs. In that sense, it's comparable to how all citizens from the Roman Empire were called Romans, regardless of their heritage. Anyway, another clue that suggests a connection between Lorellin and the Zonai/barbarians are the spirals found on some of their buildings and fabrics, which correspond to both the spirals at the Lome Labyrinths and those found on some of the Zonai stonework. This definitely raised some eyebrows back in the day, though it's not exactly clear what the implications are, whether the symbol was always part of their culture or if they simply adopted it and made it their own. We don't even know for sure if it has the same meaning to them. After all, it's not unheard of that different groups of people use the same symbol, especially one as generic as a spiral. But the most convincing proof by far is found just northeast of the village, at the aforementioned Palmyrea ruins. Here we find several Zonai pillars and walls, a shrine, 2 Sheikah pedestals, and a stone monument with an unknown scripture on it, which, as most of you know, is part of a puzzle to make the shrine appear. Now, at the time, we were pretty convinced that this circular stone was yet another Zonai structure, and so it was speculated that this scripture could be Zonai writing, the only instance of it in Breath of the Wild. However, Masterworks has since confirmed that the Zonai only had 2 kinds of scripture, neither of which look anything like the writings on the monument at Palmyrea. The color of the stone is also noticeably different from both the white and the greenish color of other Zonai monuments, so perhaps it was never a Zonai structure to begin with. If true, then it means it has to be some other language we don't know about. And where it gets interesting is that during this shrine quest, it's revealed that one of the villagers from Lorellin is actually able to read the scripture quite effortlessly, and it's never explained how or why he knows how to do this. You may also notice that the overall look of the monument bears a pretty strong resemblance to the metal discs on the Barbarian outfit, i.e. the Pokeball symbol, which has the same 2 half circles in the middle. During the height of the Zonai craze, many considered this to be the smoking gun that the villagers of Lorellin may have some kind of ancestry that traces back to the barbarian tribe of Faron. And if the Zonai and the barbarians turn out to be unrelated, then it's possible that this old theory was actually correct, just not in the way we expected. Now, of course, I'm not saying that every single villager is a direct descendant of a Ganon cultist. I think the more likely scenario is that, just like with the Sheikah and the Yiga, there was some kind of divide within the group. A divide between those who sought war and conquest, as they perhaps originally intended when they sailed into Hyrule, and those who preferred to coexist peacefully with the native population. The latter would eventually be absorbed into the Hylian Empire, giving rise to modern-day Lorelin as a Hylian village, while the barbarians, well, given that they're no longer among us, were probably hunted down and wiped out over time, or perhaps they repented at some point and joined their peaceful kin at Lorelin. In any case, it explains how the Hylians and Sheikah got their hands on one of their outfits. But that is all just a theory, of course. Maybe everything I just laid out are nothing more than coincidences, and the people of Lorelin had nothing to do with the barbarians. Maybe this guy Garini is simply a very skilled cryptographer. Maybe they saw a spiral on one of the Zonai monuments and decided, hey, that's pretty cool, let's put that on our flags and buildings. And maybe the cultists Zelda speaks of were simply a niche group of native Hyruleans who wanted to see the world burn. Either way, the mystery of the barbarians of Faron will likely persist for the foreseeable future. Unless, of course, Age of Imprisonment has something to say about it, which I would be totally down for, but I'm also skeptical since the whole barbarian thing got sort of sidelined in Tears of the Kingdom. I'm not even sure if the Zelda team actually cares or even remembers the mystery. In any case, be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because if Nintendo doesn't come up with the answers, then we will. That's what the Zelda lore community is all about after all. I also want to apologize real quick for the rather huge gap between uploads. I've been dealing with a lot of stuff on the side, like other projects outside of YouTube. And if you follow me on Blue Sky, you may have seen that my dog had to undergo some pretty invasive surgery. He's doing much better now, but he still needs a lot of attention and aftercare. And I've basically been going in and out of the animal hospital for the past weeks, which made it quite difficult to focus on work. So thank you for your patience and for watching the video. A big thanks to my mods, Patreon supporters and channel members, and I hope to see you all next time.